If a couple of people have wandered in, you're in part 2 of the privacy debate. Katrina Dow, Brian Katz, Jen Behrens and myself turning over these issues of the state of privacy, how do we do privacy properly, how do we know when we've got there. And we want to have a bit of interaction in the second session. Any questions you've got, hand up, and don't be shy to interrupt, and we'll try and go to your points. Yeah, okay, Robin Wilton. So I've just introduced Robin, but if people could Robin. Just call out who they are.
And we'll repeat your question.
Yeah, you yell out and we'll repeat.
Yeah, sure, okay. Probably not
as long as it's short.
It's short. But I think the panel made some really good points about how trust is not transitive. And the fact that we trust, say, Andre, as a great guy who is, a father of this community of ours, is, to use the example Mark gave earlier on, I think, if that's used as a proxy for us being expected to trust the privacy policy of the company that hosts the site that does the conference registration. Yeah. And that transitive thing just doesn't work. But it's built into so much of this online ecosystem. How do we get out of that? How do we break that cycle?
So in a nutshell, how do we do better at privacy policy? How do we know what we're dealing with? And how do we jump from, as information flows from one silo to another, and they've all got their own information practices. Jen, this must be something that's on the high mind of NSTIC and IDSG.
Great, great entry. I was going to say, one of the works that the IDSG has just accomplished is the framework. The framework is a series of baseline requirements: interoperability, security, usability, and also privacy. I was the Privacy Coordination Committee chair for the last year, where we delved into these things. One of the requirements is for organizations to pass downstream to all their connected entities the privacy contract that they make with the end user. So any set of controls, restraints, minimal attributes that are given permission for that company to have and use, anything that the end user conveys about how they want their privacy treated and held, that organization must distribute downstream to all their connected entities throughout those data journeys. And so that's one of the requirements that the IDF is pushing forward. So we are starting to elevate the level of expectation for how organizations should behave.
Yeah, another acronym in there, IDEF?
Identity Ecosystem Framework.
Which is kind of new.
It's very new. We just launched it Monday, and the registry is open. And again, head on downstairs to the plenary, and you can find out more. We also have a booth somewhere.
So a question for you.
Yeah.
If that gets passed downstream or to the partners that you say that they're allowed to give data, are the partners bound by that? Or is it just, this is what we told people.
Right, so what we're proposing is that the entities must be bound by this in order to attest to this higher level of privacy behavior. And that individuals should start to look for organizations to behave in such. Now, this can be enforced, of course, right now through contractual obligations. Yeah. And then we dive down into that rat hole.
I was going to say, I think the key thing is these initiatives are emerging now because we're in the Wild West. Yeah. We're at the beginning of the second decade of this uber-connected world. And we didn't work out the ethics or actually understand the new business models or the network economics or the possibilities before we all looked up our college sweetheart and reached out and said, hi. So part of it is we're settling now. That's what happens in society. You claim new territory, you then need to organize for the tribe, and then you start to say what acts in the best interest of its community. But
go ahead.
What we've learned from a technology point of view...
You can't take the new castle out of the girl.
You had to say that. What we've learned is that technology is also moving so quickly. As an adjunct to agency, we need to give this generation of digital natives some tools that allow some of these things to be trackable, traceable, revocable. So it's great that we start to look at the ethics, and it's critical. We have to have that conversation, particularly when it comes to things like AI and how information downstream is used. No question. But we also need to be able to allow if this then that rules and permissions and use terms to flow in a really low impact, super simple, saved my favorite settings way for digital natives. We have to crack that at a technology layer, because it'll just be overload for a young person to walk down the street and say, did I say that to the camera? What about the glasses you're wearing? What about, like, when we think of that environment, it's too complex.
You talk about the Wild West. It used to be to drive an automobile, you had to have an incredible amount of technical skill and understanding of how it worked. And I'm wondering whether that got abstracted away. We don't change our own oil anymore. We don't even know what oil is. So I wonder whether the same...
You have oil in your car?
I don't know.
I do. I just had to replace it.
I heard you had a horse and buggy still over in Sydney, but that's it.
All right, then I'm going to overrule you on that. The other thing about the Wild West is that the real Wild West, when we had real gold rushes and real oil rushes in the 1850s, right, we had a totally different legal system then, and a totally different sort of view about entrepreneurship, where the prospectors could come waltzing into your property and start digging up and finding gold and making money. And there was an incredible churn of social reaction to what were invasions of people's property. And then we had incredible supply chains and incredible money systems, right, where stagecoaches were crossing the country delivering cash, and there was robbery and there was crime. And what happened in that...
Sounds like just now.
Well, exactly. So what we saw then was an incredible change of social regulation, social norms, new businesses, and some really wild ideas like, why don't we stop oil companies coming into your land? Now that seems to us to be fairly ordinary now. The point I'm making is that we're finding that personal information is making people rich beyond their wildest dreams, and it's an asset that, frankly, now we could talk about regulation versus technology, and I'd like to do that, but I've got a view that the missing piece of this is regulation. It's an unpopular view in this country, but I don't think regulations were popular in the 1850s either, and now we've got them. My point is that personal information flows, I think, are going to get regulated in about 10 years' time, as they are in Europe now. And I think that it's going to lead to a whole new view. Technologists have a hard time understanding that personal information is a thing that can be regulated, because we tend to think that it's public. But, you know, spectrum, EM spectrum's public, intellectual property is public. We've got copyright on books that are public. And I think that we're going to get, even if technologists find this counterintuitive, I think we're going to get hard regulations in 10 years' time. We have to, because we can't have our digital exhaust being mined all the time in this incredibly asymmetrical way.
You can't have a generation whose core asset is going to be information and intent, and not provide a way for them to have agency over it in the way that our generation has had agency over property or cash. I mean, that's the first thing.
I love agency. It's a good way of looking at this.
The interesting thing, about a year ago, I started on privacy panels talking about the concept of this current generation of teenagers having the rights maybe to take legal action against their parents for the stuff their parents have decided to share on social media. And why? Because we know that companies like Facebook have algorithms that will impact your credit score and a whole host of things. And we know that if parents are posting things around their socioeconomic background, you know, the lifestyle, that those things will be passed on to the children. And I kind of said that in a provocative way. What if? You've got to love the French. A few months ago, the French government came out, backed by the French police, to say that they were bringing into law the rights for children to take legal action against their parents for what was posted on social media. It include, I think the starting fine was around 45,000 euros and up to a prison sentence. Now, they're looking at very specific content that has to do with child protection, which is a great place to start, the kind of images that a parent may be posting on websites that might endanger the child. There's an interesting article I was asked to comment on from the Huffington Post a few months ago around parents that had separated, and one of the parents was posting images of their young daughter online that the other parent was really concerned about. And the concerned parent went to the police, and the police said, "There's nothing we can do here. You know, there's no law here. We agree that that content is actually quite harmful and damaging to your daughter, but because there's no digital agreement in your separation, as parents, there's nothing we as police can actually do to step in and protect until something happens to the child." And this is what comes back to regulation. We need new contextual.
So, Jen, and I'll come back to Brian, and the question I noticed for you, Brian, because you're the most social amongst us panellists. You got personal reflections on Twitter, but maybe Jen can say something and we'll come back to you.
And just to continue the need for the governance, I think that, you know, technology is always going to grow leaps and bounds, and technology is never going to be the problem as far as are we getting there fast enough. It's going to be the level setting of the governance and applying the regulation and the framework around the activities. It's interesting you were saying that about the parents and the credit, and, you know, what it came to my mind is behavior, people don't change, and they do the same activities regardless of the vehicle. And what we need to remind ourselves of in the digital world, just because we have greater access and we're more fluid with it, doesn't mean our behavior is going to be any better. In a former life, I was a social worker, and one of the common problems that we had with our clients was they would ruin their credit, and so they'd start using their kids' social security numbers. But via paper and via applications. It's the same problem. It's the same behavior. It's being used in a different vehicle.
Medium.
So now where we issued governance over those activities through that system, it's time for us to levy the technical tool set on the policy that we've started generating around privacy and enforce and invoke the technological controls of privacy so that we control the behavior that we're never going to escape. It's always going to be there.
And look, it's, you know, taking a step back, you talked about the Wild West. We have the same problems now that we did then. Look at Volkswagen cheating on the emissions. Nobody checked them. They laid a claim, and actually now people are checking everybody, and they found 4, 5, 6 companies that put software in or put, an emissions defeating device in there that if it was getting tested, it worked. But in the real world, you're killing the environment, if you believe in that. You want me to be controversial, what can I say? You talked about social media and what you post. One of my daughters says, "You may not tag me in a photo on Facebook.
There you go.
You can put my photo up, you can't tag me in the post." She doesn't, and that's her thing. My other daughter says, "You're allowed to put me up. You can tag me, but I must see it before you do it." That's the rule in our house that they ascribe to. And, we'll get to your question in a second. There's a question there. But, it's interesting that your credit rating can actually be affected by what you tweet, what you put on Facebook. And that's actually where you're starting to see regulators say, maybe that shouldn't affect your credit rating. On the other hand, you have people who are getting disability insurance who on Facebook, they hurt their back, and then on Facebook you see them go water skiing. And what used to be you hired a private detective, now you hire a digital detective to look at that. How legal is that? Can you do that? Can't you do that? There are a lot of pieces here of what's private and what's not private. People will always find a way to defeat the system, though.
Yeah, question.
So I have a similar agreement with my children. I create a security group that they, and especially their friends, are not a member of. As long as I post into that group, I can post whatever I want. I can't tag because that breaks the container, right? So what do you see as what I'm trying to get at is, what are the core pieces of things we need to evaluate to establish kind of ethical and a sense of ethics and integrity, both of which are deeply missing in way too much of our life?
I mean, I'll take it from, the experience I have with my kids and, being in technology. To this day, on Twitter, I don't think I've ever used my daughter's names.
Yeah,
My daughters are 18 and 15.
right.
I've called them thing 1, thing 2. I've called them number 1, number 2.
But you call them that at home.
Sometimes.
Personally identified
But
information.
it's one of those things of, yes, people know they're my daughter. Every now and then there's a picture of them. And a couple of people who know me go, "Oh, that one's your daughter," and they'll ask me in a DM. It looks like the one on the right because it's a team picture. One of my daughters plays soccer. On Facebook, it's a little bit different because they're both on Facebook. But we were also clear, you can't be on Facebook till you're 13. They had friends who were on Facebook, Instagram, and everything else, but those were the rules that we set out. It's illegal for you to do it. I get other parents do it. I get it's important to your social group. Sorry, that's the rule here. On the other hand, we expect them to hold us accountable. One of my daughters actually looks at on Facebook, looks at every one of my posts. She taught me how to use Instagram. She said, make your account private because that's what her group does. They do not, they said, if you're famous, and she goes, I know you're Twitter famous, but you're not the type of famous person. And the interesting thing is I do enough that I actually switched it back to public, but I am careful what I post there.
Now, is that getting to your question? We're talking about sort of family, personal...
Somewhat, no. I'm really getting down to what are the things that we need to be looking at in order to be ethical and to maintain it.
Now, at a personal level or as technologists and regulators and
All of the
powers?
Is there really any reason to partition that? I don't think so. I think we end up in the same mess if like any of those things fall down.
So my last comment is education. If people don't understand what people do with this stuff, there are absolutely child predators that are surfing, Instagram, everything else. Look, whether or not they're looking at for your kid specifically, the information's out there, it's identifiable. When you get to government and everything else, there need to be ways, and I'm going to defer to the other three who actually do this as a job, there need to be ways to say the same privacy that we enjoy, and I think where you started the first session off of what you may say to somebody in a corner of a room isn't broadcast. You should be able to do that online as well. And there are tools for that, but how you do that becomes interesting.
The ethics debate or exploration is really missing in parallel to the advancing technology at the moment. I'll probably publish a blog post in the next day or so that speaks to some of the things that we do in society at a human level that include, forgiveness, empathy, understanding, the opportunity for us to have made a mistake at one point in life, to learn about that and correct that. And the person we may have been in college can be very different to the person we are, 2 years later, 20 years later. And there is something about the human condition where you can take a DEFCON 10 argument to a warm embrace by saying, I'm sorry. Like you can really take down something that is escalating simply by saying, I'm sorry, or now I understand your point of view. We don't have the equivalent of that laid onto our technology at the moment. And that I think is part of what our digital native generation is actually going to have to help lead in terms of architecting, because there are many things around blockchain technology or the idea of things being immutable or records being there from an audit perspective that I love, but I also think there's so many things around that hard and fast that we haven't reconciled with the human condition. And part of the human condition is being able to say, we change. We're complex. There's a paradox to how things unfold. And unless we find the way for that to happen in a digital sense as well, we're really going to create a very difficult decades ahead for the people that have to fix this.
Right to be forgotten.
Yeah, and so for the three of you, I actually have a question for the three of you. Looking at some of what's happening in Europe, the right to be forgotten, how does that fit into the privacy piece and also the public good piece? You have people who are trying to be forgotten for some things they did, which I don't think they should be forgotten.
And they don't get forgotten for that.
And yet, the law says what the law says. We don't have that here yet, but you said people have the right to apologize, change. I agree with that, but I have trouble mixing the two together. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Specifically on that, in terms of facts and figures, Google publishes the transparency report every month, and the law says that only specious, irrelevant, really old stuff can be filtered out of the feed. It's not the case that people get to arbitrarily rewrite history, and there's a public interest that's upheld. So about about 60% of right to be forgotten applications are rejected. Well, it's the other way around. There'll be some Europeans in the audience, but a lot of them get rejected. My view is that the European expression in right to be forgotten and some of the other decisions, they're actually very logical and, in fact, I think sane applications of very old privacy principles to modern technology. Forget technology for a second, but privacy principles going back to 1980 have said organisations and businesses ought not to collect information that they don't need, personal information. They ought to explain to people what personal information they have about them. They ought to get rid of personal information when it's no longer needed. And above all, if I've collected personal information for one reason, I should not go and arbitrarily use it for others. So we talk about information hopping from one system to another with Robin's question. I don't think that we should overcook the technology around that. I think that we should go back to the OECD principle that says you shouldn't repurpose information. And if there was a rule of law where that was the guiding principle, then a lot of this other stuff would be less important. Now, I just want to quickly say that if the principle is don't collect information that you don't need, those principles are technology neutral. And if the collection is done not directly but by big data, for example, these laws still apply. So the things that are becoming counterintuitive in Europe are simply that the technology neutral application don't collect information that you don't need. Frankly, what Google does day in, day out, millisecond by millisecond, is that it collects information behind our backs, synthesizing information that, in a sense, it doesn't need, and then it repurposes that information and makes money out of it.
But it does need it. It needs it for their business model. And so the difficulty there is that it becomes critical to shareholder return, it becomes critical to the contract with society, and the idea of breaking away from that would mean that you would have to enrol every shareholder in turning around the model. And I think this is really the opportunity again for this emerging generation, is there'll need to be new social contracts. I think it would be very hard today for any organisation to reach the scale of Google or Facebook, whereby the cost of inventory was free and it could be monetised. You just look at, and regardless of your political persuasion, you know, I watched last night Bernie Sanders reaching out to young people and saying, even though he'd done the math, he was going to keep going because there is a voice to be heard. And the kinds of things that he's talking to a younger generation about, whether we like them or not, whether we agree with them or not, the point of it is that from a historical point of view, we're at the beginning of a new century and things are changing. And the social contracts that the emerging generation will force us eventually, I hope, to adhere to, will be very different to the social contracts we grew up with.
Now, we've got right up against time. We'll take one question, I think, from a chap who's had his hand up for a while.
My name is Keegan. I'm a student at George Washington University. And so you've talked about sort of three different pillars of privacy. You've talked about the regulation, the legislation, and then the private sector and the companies that are producing all of these online services, and then the consumer, the individual, and sort of the different responsibilities that go to each of those pillars. But I'm wondering what you as industry insiders think, where the mandate's going to fall first, on the individual to sort of police themselves to be private, or on, you know, to appease consumers for the
So let me paraphrase for the mic. We're looking for the most important sort of things maybe in the next few years. Is it going to be regulatory? Is it going to be awareness? Is it going to be technology? Is it going to be self-determination? Let's go down the line as quick as we can. And that's a great way, thanks for the question, to wrap up, because it's a temperature check, right?
So I think one of the most important things that we're going to start seeing is more objective privacy risk management tool sets that are out there that can actually be applied. And domestically, we have traditionally had some very kind of soft and squishy, very nice privacy principles, but no way to actually measure risk against them. There are some nice privacy risk tools coming out. NIST has put out their privacy risk assessment methodology, which I've used, which is not perfect, but it is something, and it is a tool that can be used. And I think that that's one of the important factors where we have a lot of security risk management tool sets out there. Now we need to flip over and start building out the privacy. This will drive industry to start conforming and managing risk for their consumers, and also be followed on with the governance side of it.
Brian.
I'm going to say awareness and then regulation, which regulation comes from legislation. And the reason being it's going to start with awareness is exactly what Katrina said about Google. They built a business case based upon the fact that they could act on this data. And right now there are startups all over the place that are exploiting the weaknesses because if I take this data, I now have a business plan and I can execute on it.
For me, I think it's all of the above, and I think it's because, going back to the Wild West, is we're at this convergence point. So in Europe, we're seeing that it's going to be driven through legislation and citizen protection and specifically regulation. What we're starting to find is that both organizations and governments are reaching out to us in small pockets at the moment and saying, we think we could do better by our customers or by our citizens. We think that even though we're not being forced to do this, we think that there is a more respectful way of doing it. Yeah. And then what we're starting to also see now are the kinds of bodies or protocols or frameworks emerging that will help people navigate through those. And last but not least, I'm putting a lot of faith in this emerging generation that has had a chance to see what we've done over the last decade and say we want a different social contract.
And perfect segue. Constellation Research, we're talking about a new social compact over personal information. If personal information is this new asset class, then before we all get regulated to a place that we might not be comfortable with, then why don't we have a compact between business and consumers? The Silicon Valley cliche is that privacy can get in the way of innovation. Well, I like to think that there is innovation to be had in a business model that is privacy preserving. I mean, wouldn't that be innovative?
I think it's an and, not an or.
So
really
thank you very much, panelists. Jen, Brian, Katrina, I've loved this.
Thank you.
Thanks for your